Hi, and welcome to Esther's Gardening Adventures. I'm Esther, and today I'm going to talk about my experience growing plants, vegetables in the shade. Particularly, I'm going to talk about what ones did well, what ones did okay, but probably would do better in more sun, and then what ones were kind of an utter failure. So I'm going to go through my own experience. This is not a comprehensive list by any means, but hopefully it'll give you some sense of if you're kind of wondering yourself. So I'm going to go through a couple of things first, right? Like I like to kind of define things at the beginning. So what's full sun? Full sun is at least 6 hours of sunlight that your plants will get, direct sunlight that your plants will get in a 24-hour period. And that means, or kind of a 12-hour period, I guess. So that means at least half of the daylight time they need to be getting sun. And plants that require that are typically, I've heard, and I've also experienced now, are typically plants that produce a fruit. Not fruit in like fruit versus vegetable, but in terms of you're going to be picking the thing off of it and eating it versus eating the plant itself. So for example, kale, you eat the leaves, you eat the plant, right? But with peppers, you pick the fruit, the resulting fruit it produces off of the plant. And it's called fruit, even though it's not technically a fruit, it's a vegetable. You pick it, and therefore for some reason, they need more energy to produce those extra products that have their seeds in them. All right, so I explained full shade. Now, part shade and full shade are typically thought of as, part shade is typically thought of as 3 to 6 hours, but I think probably 4 to 6 hours is more likely an accurate thing. And then no plant other than maybe mushrooms will grow in complete darkness. So full shade actually means about 3 hours, up to 3 hours of sunlight. I will also say that if a plant needs part shade, part of the reason it needs that is because maybe it can't handle the full sun in the daytime, in the heat of the day. And so it might like 6 hours, but when it's the hottest time of the day, it might like a little bit of shade, maybe from a neighboring plant or some dappled shade from a tree or something like that. All right, so let me go through my list now of things that have worked well for me. If you've watched any of my videos, you know how much I love arugula. And yes, arugula did well in the shade. Let me say, for my backyard, the majority of it gets between probably like 3 to 5 hours of sun. Some of them get a little closer to 2, but generally it's kind of in between full shade and part shade, or part sun. So yeah, arugula does really well. These are this particular one, which it didn't, Aruca sativa. I don't know if that's a particular variety or it's just generally arugula. It did well because it's a relatively small plant. It doesn't take a whole lot of water or energy to produce. And it doesn't, honestly, when you have it in part shade, it actually doesn't go to seed. It doesn't start to flower as fast, and therefore you might get a little more time out of it, because once it starts to flower, boy, you do not want to make the mistake of eating those leaves. They are bitter and a little bit soapy. All right, so arugula. Then the next category is a bunch of lettuces, and I'm just going to show you the ones that I grew successfully, but I think you could grow like any kind of lettuce probably. Particularly leaf lettuce that you're just going to cut and come again, although I think the bigger ones will work as well. I just didn't do as much with those. So red sales lettuce did really well for me. I only tried it the second half of the summer, actually, in the shade. So that's another thing. Plants that tend to go to seed, that tend to turn fast in heat, can last a little bit longer, and you can even try them in part shade during the summer. And so I did this in the summer, believe it or not, and I got leaves out of it. Now it did turn relatively fast, so I only probably got like 2 harvests out of it, but the land there would have been useless, right? It would have been empty in the summer if I hadn't put something there. Another one that did really well in general, if you watch the video, you know I rashly duct taped this at one point, but black-seeded Simpson lettuce did really well. It does not want to focus on the envelope. There we go. Did really well. Another lettuce that did really well, but I just didn't like it because I didn't like the texture and it was small, and I'm learning that I want to grow bigger things in my garden unless they're really special, was tennis ball lettuce. It grew really well. They had a little bit of problems with slugs where the others didn't, because they did curl up a little bit, and so there was more places for the slugs to hide. But as long as I was actually taking the outer leaves on like every couple of days, then generally they were pretty good about being pest free. So if you like small kind of buttery, I don't know the right term, butterhead lettuces, this is a good one to grow. And if you have a lot of space and you don't mind growing a small lettuce, it's actually pretty good. Turns out I don't like butterhead lettuce that much. This one I grew in late summer into the fall, and I got some beautiful heads, and I pushed it too far, and a frost happened, and I went out in the middle of the night, like just as soon as it got dark and the frost was happening, tried to rescue them, but they were already turning translucent, and I tried to put them in water to like halt the anyway, they grew well. I only got to taste like a couple of leaves on them because I pushed the fall winter frost too hard, but I'm definitely going to grow these in shade again. All right, so some that did okay in part shade for me was Swiss chard. It took a little bit longer than the timeline listed, 14, oh, that's sprouting. It took a little longer than I expected to grow. And maybe I just don't know enough about the plant. That's quite possible. But I think they probably would have done better with a little more sun. Then two that I haven't talked a lot about, I got from a friend, is Vita Machi greens. It's kind of like an Asian green. And Komatsuna greens. These actually did really well. The Vita Machi are like these little tiny greens, and I had them in a box with my other herbs on the deck, and they grew great, and they were delicious, and they had a nice texture and flavor. They did turn to seed. They did go to seed relatively early compared to the other lettuces. And the Komatsuna, I got a little bit out of that, but that was really heavily attacked by slugs and other pests. And in fact, it kind of ended up being a sacrificial plant to the other plants in that bed. So I'm not sure how it'll do in your area, but that's why I'm not growing either of these again, because there's other priorities in the moment. So I grew Nero de Toscano kale in that bed, in one of the shade beds, and I'm going to do it again this year. But I have seen pictures and videos of people who grew this in full sun areas, and the plants were huge. So, you know, I don't have a lot of space in my front yard for something like this, although I might still do one since they were so huge and beautiful. But I'm probably going to actually primarily grow this in the backyard again, because I need to use the space in the backyard. I want to have something that produces that I like, that'll produce all summer and even into the fall, minus pests. And so I'm going to do it in the backyard, but I honestly think that if you're trying to decide and you have plenty of options for the backyard or for your shaded area, forget backyard. Backyard to me means shaded. For your shaded area, then try growing kale in the sun, and maybe try a plant in the shade and see which one works better. Then there's also peas. I did Little Marvel, which are shelling peas, and sugar snap peas. And besides my transplanting issues that I've talked about and kind of wended lessons learned, they grew relatively well in a part shade with about 3 to 4 hours of sun. And in fact, I think they didn't go to seed as fast as others, which I'm kind of saying for all the plants at this point in the part shade area. But I think they didn't produce as much as they could have if they'd been in full sun. You know, this packet says 6 to 12 hours. This one says 6 to 12 hours on the back. And I really think that probably they would do a lot better. Am I going to grow them in the front yard this year? I really love sugar snap peas, so I might try doing a couple. But my front yard is so tiny, so maybe I'll plant them where I'm going to have my vining summer beans later on, and then just be harsh and pull them up, you know, by the time I have to plant my summer beans, give them a couple months to go. But you can grow these in the shade. You can grow these in part shade. Just be aware they might not be as heavy of a producer. All right. 3 vegetables that I utterly failed on in my part shade beds. Okay, I'll take that back. I didn't utterly fail, but they took a long time. They took way more than 30 days. My radishes, these early scarlet radishes, they're supposed to only take like 30 days, or maybe even 25 days to be done. And they took about 45 days. And so if you're willing to have, And even then, they were kind of runty. They weren't really as big as they should have been compared to the photos I've seen of other people's early radishes, early scarlet globe radishes. So you could try these in the shade. You know, they're such fast growers. I think they would probably do okay, but I think I'm going to try these in the front yard this spring. Then, yeah, these two were utter failures. New Karuta carrots. I did pull one out and it was like more thin than my pinky and it was about this long and I ate it and I gave a tiny bit to my husband to eat and it tasted really good. But while I got tops growing out of the ground and I used the tops for pesto and other things, I didn't really get any carrots growing down into the soil. And there was plenty of space for them to grow. There was at least 6 inches, so they didn't even hit a place where they couldn't grow any further. And I really think that, and I direct sowed these, so I really think that if I'm going to try to grow carrots, which I'm not going to this year because of my spacing issues and priorities, but if you grow carrots, grow them in the full sun. This says 6 to 8 hours, so yeah, it needs full sun. And then beets. I got these pretty leaves coming out for the beets and literally not any kind of globe-shaped anything in the soil. They look like your regular straight down tuber type root for a plant that when you pick it has a little bit of red that gets on your finger. They did not do well in part shade. So if you want to try beets, do them in a sunny place. And I think that wraps up all of the ones on my list. Now, I should say that I wasn't purposefully experimenting with beets and carrots and other things in a part shade. It just was by happenstance. I hadn't really paid attention to the sun patterns ahead of gardening. And so when you see my list of 12 tips for new gardeners was like know where the sun is at what times of the day and for how many hours. And so I had planted a bunch of these thinking they'd get enough sun. I knew it'd be slightly shaded, but I thought they'd get at least maybe like 5-6 hours. And they did not once that tree above the backyard filled out. That huge, like 85-foot sweet gum tree, which just covers my entire backyard, part of my 3 neighbors' backyards. It's just humongous. So, hope this has been helpful to you if you're trying to decide what you can grow in part shade. I will also say that most of the herbs that I grew, like cilantro, thyme, oregano, not basil, dill, they all grew fine in part shade on the deck in the backyard. Basil definitely needs full sun, although it can handle a little bit of shade, I think, in the heat of the day, so I planted it around my tomatoes and then I planted them around my tomatoes and they did really well. But yeah, you can go herbs in part shade too. So, all right. So I hope this was helpful to you, as I was saying. If you enjoyed this content, please hit the like button. If you are already a subscriber, awesome, guys. We hit 500 subscribers this week. I honestly never thought we'd get above 100. And then when we hit 100, I thought, okay, we'll get 200 and it'll be awesome. We have grown by 400 subscribers in less than a month. 400 subscribers in less than a month. In 28 days. Crazy. And I love all of you for joining and thank you for participating in this adventure. And if you aren't already a subscriber, it's time to join so you can see more of this kind of content. And make sure to hit the bell so you get alerts when I've actually posted videos, which I'm hoping will be very frequent. All right. So thank you for tuning in and I will see you next time.